Ethics Week started in 1988. John Houck was our kind of the godfather of ethics. He passed away. We're trying to figure out a way to keep his heritage going. So along came Ethics Week. Now, the reason we hold it in February is that in the College of Business, we talk ethics 24/7. If you love your wife, you love your loved ones, on Valentine's Day, you send them a flower or a card, right? So we hold Ethics Week during the week of Valentine's Day, just to be very explicit about our love for ethics. Today's speaker is Jimmy Gurulé. I've known this guy for a long, long time. His one major weakness, he's a recovering attorney. And as a matter of fact, when I asked somebody about who should I ask about giving us a legal history of tariffs, Jimmy Gurulé's name kept coming up time and time again. He's on the law faculty at Notre Dame. Jimmy, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Thanks very much. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for the invitation that you've extended to me. It's a real pleasure to be here and to talk about a topic that is particularly timely at this particular point. So I don't know, I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but I'm sure you've heard that the Trump administration's use of tariffs under something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, and I'm going to go into that in some detail, has been challenged. The legality of using this particular statute to collect tariffs from goods being imported into the United States is an issue before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is expected to rule on it literally, any day. I think the next release of Supreme Court opinions is going to be on February 20th, and there's a lot of observers like myself that are very anxiously awaiting that ruling to see whether or not the Supreme Court upholds the Trump administration's use of tariffs and strikes it down. And then if it's determined to be illegal, unlawful, the way that they've been collected, then the implications of that are quite breathtaking in terms of the impact that's going to have from an economic and budget perspective. But let me just add one other thing. So when I talk about the International Economic Powers Act, IEPA is the acronym, this is a statute that I knew nothing about 20 plus years ago. But in 2001, I was appointed by then President George W. Bush to serve as Undersecretary for Enforcement at the Treasury Department. So I took a 2-year leave of absence from my faculty duties, went to Washington, D.C., and was sworn in as Undersecretary at the Treasury about 3 weeks before the 9/11 terror attacks occurred. And when that happened, President Bush announced a war on terrorism and said, among other things, we're going to go after the financing of terrorist organizations, Al-Qaeda specifically. And that became my primary responsibility for the 2 years that I was on leave of absence from Notre Dame. And going after the financing and imposing economic sanctions on individuals and entities that were providing financial assistance to Al-Qaeda and related terrorist organizations, that fell under my responsibilities, the economic sanctions. A Treasury entity, agency called the Office of Foreign Assets Control. Office of Foreign Assets Control has responsibility for the entire U.S. government's economic sanctions program. And that was an agency that was under my supervision when I was Undersecretary. So I became intimately familiar with a statute that is now being used for a very different purpose, and that is to impose and collect tariffs on foreign governments. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of tariffs, but also kind of the weaponization of tariffs by the Trump administration. So what's the legal authority for tariffs? And I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but the U.S. Constitution, specifically Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 provides that Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts, to provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. To make a long story short, I mean, just to break this down into common language, the Constitution delegates the power to impose and collect taxes on Congress, not the President. And tariffs are a type and form of tax. They're a tax that's imposed on goods that are being imported into the United States from a foreign country. So this question about the legality of the Trump administration's tariff program raises a very important constitutional issue, and it's an issue involving the separation of powers. The Constitution delegates this power to Congress, and therefore, what authority does the executive branch have with respect to laying and collecting taxes? And then in addition, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 4 is titled Power of Congress to Regulate Commerce. And the Constitution under this provision gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. And the tariff program in the Trump administration has been used basically as a means to influence foreign policy and commerce between the United States and foreign governments. And so again, that role appears to have been delegated by the Constitution to Congress, not the executive branch. So Congress has exercised its authority under the Constitution with respect to imposing tariffs in several statutes. And I'm just going to touch on a couple just to give you an idea of how this works. So in Section 232 of something called the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, so going all the way back to 1962, the legislature, again, pursuant to its constitutional authority, passed something called the Trade Expansion Act, and specifically Section 232 provides that the president can impose trade sanctions, restrictions, such as tariffs, so specifically addresses tariffs, on imported goods deemed to threaten national security. So there's a limitation, there's a restriction. So Congress is giving this authority to the president, but only with respect to imposing tariffs on goods that threaten national security. So not for any purpose, but a very specific purpose related to national security. And then in addition, Section 232 provides that investigations are to be conducted to determine which imports or specific goods threaten national security. So there has to be this investigation conducted first before the president can do that. And Congress is determined, how that investigation should be conducted, who conducts that investigation. So it's not giving the president carte blanche to go ahead and impose tariffs for any reason, any amount on any country for any purpose. It's very restricted, for purposes of national security, but only after a investigation has been conducted and specific goods have been identified as threatening national security. And then in 1974, Congress passed the Trade Act, it's often referred to as Relief from Unfair Trade Practices. And Section 301 provides that the United States Trade Representative, the USTR, uses this authority to address practices that are unreasonable, discriminatory, or burdensome on U.S. commerce. So if there's unfair trade practices with foreign countries, then tariffs can be used to try to address the unfairness of those trade practices. So again, very limited purpose. There has to be some finding of unreasonable, discriminatory, or burdensome trade practices that again impact U.S. commerce. Initially, these tariffs targeted technology, intellectual property, industrial goods with duties often as high as 25%, a tax of 25% of the goods coming in. Since 2018, the USTR has imposed tariffs ranging from 7.5% to 25%, no more than 25%, totaling approximately $370 billion worth of tariffs on U.S. imports from China. So this particular act, Relief from Trade Practices, has targeted China. I wouldn't say exclusively, but has targeted China and imposed tariffs on goods coming in, from China, equaling $370 billion worth of tariffs. And then the last act that I'm going to talk about is Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. This is also known as the Balance of Payment or Balance of Payments Authority. And Section 122 empowers the U.S. President to impose temporary, and I highlight that, temporary, urgent import restrictions such as tariffs up to 50% or quotas for up to 150 days to address large U.S. balance of trade deficits or currency depreciation. So what I want to highlight here is Congress is delegating its power to the president, but in a very restrictive way. And this is to, again, address, trade imbalance, but it's limited in time and limited in amount. So Congress is restricting the president's authority with respect to imposing tariffs, saying, look, you can only do it for 150 days, not indefinitely, limited period of time, to address large balance of trade deficits. And the tariffs can only be up to 15%, no more than that. So again, Congress is delegating certain power to the president regarding tariffs, but it's restricting the president's authority with respect to the imposition of those tariffs, both temporally and then also with respect to the percentage of tariffs that can be imposed on goods being imported to the United States. So the weaponization of tariffs by the Trump administration. So the imposition of tariffs has been the centerpiece of the Trump administration's economic and foreign policy. And basically what the Trump administration has decided to do is to use tariffs as a penalty to influence foreign policy, to influence policy of foreign governments that the Trump administration disagrees with. So it isn't necessarily about national security, it isn't necessarily about trade imbalances. It's for a broad number of purposes. Some of those do include trade imbalances, but there are a number of other purposes for which tariffs have been imposed on foreign countries by the Trump administration. And the ultimate question is that lawful? Does any president have the authority to do what the current president is doing with respect to the imposition of tariffs? So beginning in February 2025, shortly after the president was sworn in as a president for his second term in office, he issued a series of executive orders. And this term executive orders is really important. And these executive orders, through these executive orders, he imposed tariffs. And there's really kind of two major kind of tranches of tariffs that he imposed pursuant to executive orders. The first are referred to as trafficking tariffs that are imposed in February of 2025. And they targeted imports from China, pursuant to Executive Order 14195, Mexico, Executive Order 14194, and Canada, Executive Order 14193, over concerns that those countries failed to do enough to stop the flow of fentanyl into the United States and illegal immigration. So what's interesting here, a couple of things. First of all, I know a little bit about this. I used to be a federal prosecutor before I joined the law faculty at Notre Dame, and was a federal prosecutor in Los Angeles in the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I was deputy chief of the major narcotics section, prosecuting, drug cartels, and it's something that I've kind of kept up with in terms of, my current position at the faculty, on the faculty of Notre Dame. And one thing that's pretty clear is a very small percentage of fentanyl coming to the United States is coming in from Canada. I mean, it's a minuscule amount with respect to the overall quantity. I mean, fentanyl is coming to the United States from China and across the U.S.-Mexico border, not from Canada. And so that kind of begs the question, well, what's the real reason? Why are these tariffs being imposed on Canada? What does it have to do with the flow of fentanyl into the United States? So it's a kind of relevant question. We can get to that in a moment. And then the next category of tariffs are referred to as reciprocal tariffs. And those were imposed by executive orders in April of 2025. And here the president imposed a baseline tariffs of 10% on virtually all countries across the board. It's going to just straight across the board, kind of regardless of what the trade imbalance is or isn't with these countries, we're going to impose a 10% tariffs, a tax on any goods coming into being imported into the United States. And the higher tariffs, anywhere from 11% to 50%. On some countries, the tariffs were 50%. Every good, all items coming in from that country, 50% tariffs. And here he was citing large trade deficits and the lack of reciprocity. And the executive order was 14257, and this is where, again, this International Emergency Economic Powers Act comes into play, and I'm going to discuss that here in a moment. But there's this other kind of miscellaneous category. So we have the trafficking tariffs and we have the reciprocal tariffs, but we have these other tariffs that are very country specific. So for example, the president imposed tariffs on Brazil. And the reason that he imposed tariffs on Brazil is that this was in response to the Brazilian government's prosecution of former Brazilian president, Jair Bolsonaro. The president didn't agree with the investigation and prosecution of the former president of Brazil. And so he decided to go ahead and penalize Brazil because he disagreed with the prosecution of the former president by imposing tariffs. And so the question is, well, what does that have to do with the trade imbalance? What does that have to do with national security? What does that have to do with any legitimate reason other than just, Bolsonaro's my friend and I don't like what the Brazilian government is doing with respect to prosecuting him. And they also the president also imposed tariffs on India. And this was in response to the fact that India was importing and buying Russian oil. And so he decided, that was a bad idea. And because that was providing, income to Russia, and Russia's using that income in the armed conflict and the war in Ukraine. And so he wanted to cut off the stream of money going from India to Russia by the importation of Russian oil. And then again, it's like, well, what does that have to do with trade imbalances? And what does that have to do with unfair trade practices and so on? And so these are just a couple of examples of how tariffs have been used really in an unprecedented way by this president, really to shape foreign policy and to penalize foreign governments, to have them change their policy in a way that is acceptable by the Trump administration. So what's the legal authority? If I stated before, the Constitution is pretty explicit that it gives Congress the power to impose tariffs, which are taxes, and it gives Congress the power to regulate commerce. Then what's the claimed legal authority for the president's tariff program? And he is using something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA. It was a law that was enacted by Congress in 1977. And here's what it provides. So it grants the president considerable authority to impose economic sanctions to deal with peacetime emergencies originating abroad. So therefore International Emergency Economic Powers Act. So it has to be an emergency, international, it has to be international, originating abroad. Therefore international emergency. Economic powers to impose economic sanctions. Section 1701 is the key, the heart of the act. And it provides that the president can use the law to, quote, deal with any unusual and extraordinary threat which has its source in whole or in substantial part outside the United States, i.e. international, to the national security, foreign policy, or economy of the United States, if he declares a national emergency with respect to that threat. So let me break this down. So basically what this means, if the president declares a national emergency, which he will do through an executive order, and he claims that this national emergency, that there is an unusual or an extraordinary threat emanating from abroad, or substantially from abroad, that threat threatens national security, foreign policy, or the economy, and he declares a national emergency with respect to that, then he's afforded some expansive powers to impose economic sanctions to confront that threat. So what he has done through these executive orders that I referred to with respect to Mexico and China and Canada and India and Brazil is he's used this language. And basically, you know, he said, there's a national emergency. I don't know what the unusual and extraordinary threat is in Brazil with respect to former President Bolsonaro that is a threat to the national security, foreign policy, or the economy of the United States, but that's what he's done. And so he's issued this executive order claiming again that there's this threat to foreign policy, economy, national security, and therefore he has all these powers, economic powers, to impose economic sanctions, including tariffs. So this is it. And so what is a national emergency? Justifying the trafficking of tariffs, you know, the imposing of tariffs, or the trade deficits. You know, what's the emergency? What's the justification for tariffs imposed against Brazil and India and Canada, you know, for example. So here's where it gets really tricky and very specific. So 1702, section 1702 of the Act provides that when there is a national emergency, he declares this national emergency, issues his executive order, then the president may, quote, regulate importation or exportation of property in which any foreign country or a national thereof has an interest. So what they've done, the Trump administration, the Department of Justice lawyers have said, well, tariffs are basically involve the regulation of importation. It involves the regulation of importation of goods. So it's a way to regulate the importation of goods. So they've read into the statute tariffs by interpreting this general language of the power. You know, once he makes this declaration, he has these economic sanctions, and these economic sanctions can be used to regulate importation of goods from a foreign country or a foreign national who has an interest in those goods. So that's the theory. And that's the issue before the United States Supreme Court, is does this statute, this specific general language of regulate importation, does it include the authority to impose tariffs on countries for all these reasons? This past summer, August of 2025, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, which hears appeals from the Court of International Trade, held by a vote of 7-4 that IEEPA's grant of presidential authority to regulate imports does not authorize the tariffs that Trump had imposed. That's the issue that's on appeal now, that's pending before the United States Supreme Court. So this U.S. Court of Appeals Federal Circuit struck it and said, no, this language of regulate importation doesn't include tariffs. And on November 5th of last year, the U.S. Supreme Court heard an oral argument on the matter. And I listened in on a good part of the oral argument, and it was pretty clear that several members of the Supreme Court were very skeptical of the government's arguments that IEEPA authorized the tariffs that are currently being imposed on these foreign imports. So what I'm looking for now, first of all, many of us that are really interested in this topic have been following very closely the Supreme Court's opinions this term. And every time there's an announcement the Supreme Court is going to be issuing an opinion, everyone's like, okay, today's the day, they're going to be ruling on this matter. And so there's been like maybe three dates that are passed now, the court hasn't ruled. The next date is February 20th. And so there's a lot of us that are kind of cautiously optimistic that the Supreme Court will rule on this issue here in a couple of weeks, a little over a week. So we'll see. So what are petitioners' arguments? So the petitioner in this case is this Voss Selections Inc. It's a small company, and basically it's saying, these tariffs are killing us. Because first of all, it raises a really interesting question: who pays for the tariffs? The Trump administration has maintained that the foreign company that's importing the goods into the United States or exporting them for importation in the United States is paying the tariffs. But the way that it really works out is that whoever is purchasing the goods in the United States is paying for the tariffs. And then that cost is not just being consumed or subsumed by the company, but is passing those costs on to the consumer by raising the prices of the goods that are being imported. And so this was one of the companies that was saying, hey, this is different. Now I'm having to pay this much more for the goods that are coming in, and it's affecting my bottom line, and therefore I'm having to pass on the cost to my customers. And my customers don't like it. And it's a problem. So it's raising the price of these goods. So what are some of the petitioner's arguments? Well, the first one, which makes a lot of sense to me, is that, hey, the word tariff is never mentioned in the statutory text of IEPA. So you would think that if Congress intended tariffs to be part of this regulate importation, that somewhere in this very complicated, lengthy, complicated statute, the word tariffs would appear. It doesn't. Nowhere. Second, no president before Trump has ever relied on IEPA to impose tariffs. It's never happened. Instead, what's happened is that the president has relied upon Congress to pass legislation conferring authority on the president to impose tariffs in very restricted, focused, narrow ways. Temporal time limit, cap on the percentage of tariffs, what they could be for the purpose, etc. So no president before Trump has ever relied on IEPA to impose tariffs. A couple of other arguments, these get a little kind of technical into the weeds, but interpreting tariffs, this is a big argument before the Supreme Court during oral argument, would run afoul of something called the major questions doctrine, which the Supreme Court says, the Supreme Court came up with this doctrine called the major questions doctrine, which requires Congress to be explicit when it wants to give the president the power to make decisions with vast economic and political significance. You got to make it clear. If Congress is going to be delegating its authority to the president, and that delegation of power has vast economic and political consequences, you better make it clear that that's what you intended. And the argument is Congress didn't make it clear, hasn't made it clear, that IEPA could be used for this purpose. And then the last argument, kind of major argument, is relying on IEPA to impose tariffs would violate something called the non-delegation doctrine. And this is the principle that Congress cannot delegate its power to other branches of government unless, again, it gives an intelligible principle. What's the purpose? What are the limitations? What are the restrictions? It gives guidance to the president on what that power that Congress is delegating to the executive can be used for. It's kind of intelligible principle guiding the use of that delegation of power. And the claim here is that Congress hasn't done that. They haven't given any intelligible principle that would limit or restrict the president's use of tariffs under IEPA. So what are the Trump administration's arguments? Again, they say, oh, the tariffs squarely, fall within the text of IEPA, regulate or importation. The term regulate importation. Well, squarely? Really? Why? Why does regulate importation include tariffs? It doesn't seem all that explicit or all that clear that it does. And then the DOJ lawyers, argue that IEPA doesn't authorize unlimited tariffs because IEPA imposes limits, right? You have to first declare an emergency, a national emergency. It has to be as unusual, extraordinary. It has to threaten national security, foreign policy, and the economy. And then you have to follow those procedures, and you have to report back. There's reporting requirements. You have to report back to Congress regarding the use of these economic sanctions in this way. And then with respect to this, major questions doctrine that I just referred to, the Trump lawyers argue that this has never been applied in the foreign affairs context. That under the Constitution, the president is the sole organ for foreign affairs. And the courts aren't going to interfere. They're going to be very deferential to the president in the context of foreign affairs. Because again, foreign affairs doesn't involve necessarily legal issues that are appropriate for the court to be involved in, to intervene in. And these are political matters, policy matters. And so we're going to defer to the president. We're going to grant great deference to the president. So the argument is the major questions doctrine has never been applied in foreign affairs context where Congress has given, and the courts have given the president, broad authority to govern, foreign affairs. So then the other interesting question is this, and this is what I think is really holding up the Supreme Court, because I don't think that the legal issue is all that complicated. But I think the practical implications are complicated. And the reason being is that in 2025, and again, these tariffs started, in February, and then again in April of 2025, the US government has collected $264 billion in tariffs just last year. And of course, the tariffs are continuing now in 2026. So that's a lot of money. I mean, relatively speaking, at least it seemed like a lot of money to me, $264 billion. So what if the president loses the tariffs case? If the Supreme Court rules against President Trump, will the tariffs have to be repaid? And if they're going to have to be repaid, then what's the process for doing that? There had to be some electrical, computerized mechanism for imposing tariffs. And can they just go back to that system or that software or whatever and decided, okay, you guys, this particular company, Voss Selections Inc., the party in the Trump case, yeah, we can determine how much you paid in tariffs last year in 2025, and we're just going to pay that amount back to you. But they're going to have to do that, thousands of times over with respect to every other company that paid tariffs on imported goods into the United States. So, it's going to be complicated. It's going to be messy in terms of figuring out the repayment mechanism. But perhaps even more problematic is going to be paying back $264 billion. What's that going to do to the Treasury? What's that going to do to the trade deficit? One of the arguments the Trump administration has been making in support of the tariff program is, well, it's reduced the trade deficit. Got this $264 billion and it's reduced the trade deficit. And that's a good thing. Well, now if they have to pay it back, then it's going to balloon the trade deficit. It's going to be money out of the Treasury. And so the economic and political consequences of this are profound. And so the concern that I think, and this is my own speculation, is maybe the Supreme Court is taking its time in rendering its opinion because they understand that the ruling or the use of IEPA was unlawful in this case, but they're really concerned about the consequences of the ruling and the impact that it's going to have on foreign policy, the impact it's going to have on the Treasury and the economy, and then maybe the political implications, the fallout as a result, of that. Which raises the question, is that this is about ethics, is that something that ethically the Supreme Court should even be concerned with? Should the Supreme Court only be concerned with the legal issue? What's the legal issue before the court? And then with respect to other political, foreign affairs consequences, that's beyond the scope. That's not their area of concern. So we'll see. We'll see. Or maybe the Supreme Court's trying to kind of split the difference. We're going to declare that the tariffs are unconstitutional, they're illegal, but they don't have to be repaid. Maybe. And so maybe they're trying to see if they can come up with 5 votes on the Supreme Court that's willing to go that way. It's illegal, but you don't have to pay them back. Or it's illegal and you only pay them back this way. There's limitations and restrictions on the repayment or something along those lines. So it's gotten really messy here. And I think that this is the issue that could very well be holding up the decision by the Supreme Court. And again, we should know relatively soon, what the Supreme Court's decision is on this matter. So that's all I've got. So let me know if you've got some questions for me. Any questions? Comments? What's this guy talking about? He doesn't know what the heck he's talking about, so, yes?
If in fact the Supreme Court would rule that the president has overreached authority, but then issued a compromise saying, well, we're not gonna have to pay all these tariffs back that were collected, I would suggest it might lead to other challenges,
Yeah.
legal challenges.
Yeah,
Because if I were a company
yeah,
that had to pay a significant amount of tariffs, and now it's deemed that the president had an overreach,
yeah,
I want my money back.
sure.
Just a.
No, you're absolutely right. There's no question about it. So those are the kinds of issues that I think may be kind of the cloud over the Supreme Court in terms of the implications of their decision. So if we say, you got to repay everything, oh my gosh, that's going to be this huge headache for the Treasury Department, and it's going to balloon the trade deficit and so on. But then if you try to compromise, say, well, it's illegal, but you don't have to pay it back, these people say, what do you mean?
Yeah.
If it's illegal, what I was required to do was unlawful. I had to pay this money, and it was illegal for me to have to pay this money. I suffered an injury,
Exactly.
and I want to be compensated for the injury. And the injury is the amount of tariffs that I had to pay that were illegal. And times, how many thousands of companies that have paid tariffs over the last,
That's where I could see that going.
yeah, it's a real issue, it's a real concern. Yeah, but- Go ahead.
Yeah, do you think that there would be a third option potentially?
Okay.
Because neither of these are palatable,
Right,
right? Like I'm thinking in lines of having a third option of saying that yes, it's not legal, what he was really doing, but there had to be a statute over it, like how long he could do it, and maybe take it that way, because all these sections, like you mentioned, they seem to have a timeline attached to it, and if you don't put a timeline to it, then it's
but the
wrong.
question would be, what's the authority for the timeline? What's the authority for the cap?
Yeah,
So if there's a cap, 15%, 20%, not 50%.
yes, or
What's the
100%.
authority for the cap? What's the authority for 150 days or 6 months or whatever it is? That's the issue. Now, so what's interesting though is that Secretary of the Treasury, the Senate has stated that if they lose, they're going to go back and recoup they'll go ahead and reimpose tariffs, but they're going to do it under existing statutory authority. So they'll go back and they'll do this.
They do the 15%.
They'll go back here and say, okay, if we can't get it one way, maybe we can get it this way. Maybe we get some of it will fit under the Trade Act of 1974, or some of these tariffs may fit under Section 301 of the Trade Act. Some of these may fit under the Trade Expansion Act, and we'll do it that way. And so that would be to kind of offset that financial loss that the government is going to incur. Or maybe in addition, they'll say, well, look, now, by the way, where were the tariffs against Brazil because of the prosecution of Bolsonaro fit? There's not going to be any authority for that. Or India, we don't like the fact that you're buying Russian oil, where does that fit? Maybe they go back to Congress and they say, or he goes back to Congress and we want you to enact new legislation
Yes.
that would authorize me, the president, to do A, B, and C that I can't do under any of these acts. So it could be some combination. So that could be their response. That could be the Trump administration. And Bessent has already kind of hinted to that. We're going to go back and we'll do it anyway. Well, that's not quite that easy because a lot of what you're doing is just not going to fit with any existing legislation. So maybe some of it will, and you can get some of those tariffs back, or you can reimpose those tariffs. But some of it, you're just going to need new legislation because it just doesn't fit under any of these trade acts that Congress has authorized the president to impose tariffs.
Speaking of that, do you think that Congress could possibly use budget reconciliation to avoid the filibuster to do this now that that $260 million is part of the federal government's purse?
Yeah, I mean, that's it, right? I mean, the Congress is having to look at some creative ways to compensate or offset what is potentially going to be this huge $264 billion loss to the Treasury. So how do you do it? Is a budget reconciliation, is that going to fix it or not? So it could be some combination. And we'll go back to some of these other trade acts and we'll just reimpose the tariffs and we'll try to make up the difference, through a new statute or through some type of budgetary, reconciliation or action. I don't know, but it creates a huge dilemma. If the Supreme Court rules against the president, there's this huge financial, economic, foreign policy dilemma that the government is going to face, and they have to figure out how to deal with it.
Historically, how broad is the term regulate, and has it ever been used to levy fees or taxes in other contexts?
No, so that was an argument that came up. In fact, our own Justice Coney Barrett, during the oral argument, raised that issue. And she said, well, you know, there's these other statutes enacted by Congress dealing with tariffs, or no, there's other statutes that have this language, regulate importation. Have any of those statutes that have the language regulate importation ever been used this way to authorize tariffs? And the Solicitor General's response was no. I mean, that he couldn't identify any other statute where that language had been interpreted that broadly to include tariffs. So that was another kind of losing argument for the administration. But it was interesting. It was an issue a question that I'm very, my recollection is correct, that this was the question that Justice Amy Coney Barrett raised during oral argument, and the Solicitor General could not cite a statute where that was the case.
If the Supreme Court simply rules that what he did was illegal,
Right,
and that's the ruling.
yeah,
Now, the people that claim they lost money because they paid these tariffs, they're gonna have to file a lawsuit to specifically identify how much money they lost.
right.
But how much money did they lose if in fact their customers all paid the higher price? The person that really lost is the customer.
Yeah, well, the problem is,
And so
yeah.
the Trump administration can say, oops, oh, well, okay, well, at least we gained $264 billion. We don't care, and if you want to sue, you can sue till the lawyers come home because we'll be out of office and there'll be
well,
somebody else.
nobody's going to sue unless they can prove an injury.
Right,
So if there hasn't been an injury, then they're not going to be successful in suing. But that assumes that all of the tariffs were borne by the consumer. And that hasn't been the case in all instances. So in some cases, the company has borne at least a part or percentage of the tariffs. So they've kind of split the difference. So we'll take the hit to this extent. We can't take the entire hit of paying all the tariffs ourselves. So we'll pass on some of that to the customer. And to that extent, maybe we have an injury that we want to have compensated, but it's going to be, they're going to have to make the case. They're going to have to show
well, they're
what
gonna
that
have to
number
make the
is.
case anyway,
Yeah.
because the Supreme Court's not gonna say give all the money back. They're just gonna, they need to say, this is illegal, and y'all need how to figure it out.
Yeah,
But if they don't say it's illegal, the game's over.
yeah, if they don't say it's illegal, the game's over, and they can continue doing what they're doing.
I mean, but this continually breaking all the laws is just crazy.
Well, like I
I mean,
said,
all the Department of Defense attorneys that have told expats that it's illegal to do this have been fired. They've been escorted out of the building. I mean, this kind of stuff just can't go on, and somebody has
Well-
to stand up.
well, it's interesting too. So here's another argument, and this was made during the oral argument before the Supreme Court. So if you can use IEPA in this way, and by the way, you declare an emergency, it has its source outside the United States, it affects national security, foreign policy, the economy, then why do you need this other specific legislation that Congress has passed? Doesn't IEPA just consume everything, subsume everything? So doesn't it just render these other acts, these three acts that I referred to, these sections that I referred to, basically superfluous? Why does Congress do it if the president could do it this way through IEPA? And by the way, what does it do then with this provision here in the Constitution that says Congress has the power to lay and collect taxes?
Right.
Isn't the president doing that? And so isn't it unconstitutional? Isn't it a violation of, so maybe at the most fundamental level, it's not only a statutory interpretation of issue of what does regulate importation mean, but it's a constitutional issue of separation of powers. And the Constitution says Congress has the power to lay taxes, not the president. And is the president usurping the Congress's powers under the Constitution, rendering it unconstitutional, not merely illegal, but unconstitutional. So, I mean, this is a big deal. This case is a big deal, and the consequences, politically, economically, are huge. And I'm sure that the justices are, pulling out their hair, trying to figure out, how are we gonna resolve this?
Well, why are they pulling out their hair? I mean, the point you made at the end about the ethics.
Yeah,
This is really ethics.
yeah.
They're gonna sell out the Constitution for $264 billion. I mean, they talk about an ethical issue.
Well, that's why I said, for me, as a lawyer, I think the Supreme Court should only consider the constitutional issue, the statutory construction issue, that's it.
Right.
And the political, foreign policy, economic, that's not a legal issue.
Right.
That's a policy issue, and policy issues Congress deals with, the president deals with, so they should stay away from it. If they wanted to just do it the clean way, they would just decide the legal issue and then wash their hands and say, President, you created this mess
Right.
by using this authority in an illegal way. Now you have to fix it. We're not gonna step into that. We're not gonna step into that quagmire and try to bail you out on the implications of, political, foreign policy implications of what you've done. Let me have a question of Quebec.
How do you foresee, or do you have like any commentary on like Justice Roberts? He's like, I feel Chief Justice Roberts is continually like trying to like keep the Supreme Court like apolitical and like whatnot. So how do you foresee?
I think that horse left the barn a long time ago.
maintain the like the reputation of the courts. How do you foresee him like trying to balance
Well, I'm sure he's grappling with that too.
that with
Because again, I don't want to go too far afield, but there's something that's been called the shadow docket, which the Supreme Court is taking these cases where the lower courts, even Circuit Court of Appeals, have imposed temporary restraining orders on the government, to arrest immigrants and impose racial profiling, to arrest and so on. And the Trump and the Roberts Court has time and time again lifted those restraining orders in favor of the president without any legal argument, without any briefing. It basically said, oh, we'll schedule this for briefing later, but for right now, I'm going to overrule the lower courts and we'll deal with it down the road. And it's been consistently in favor of the Trump administration, like, I don't know, 20 times or more. So to me, that's why I said I think the horse is already out the barn in terms of the political implications or political image or impact on the court's reputation.
You focus a lot on collecting this revenue. What authority does the executive have to actually spend tariff inflows? And because I would think it at least partially encumbered.
Yeah, it raises an interesting issue, and I think it had broader implications, the question that you've raised, because we see the president time and time again basically saying, well, those funds that have been authorized by Congress for this purpose, I'm going to hold those up. I'm going to hold up money for the tunnel in New York City, or I'm going to hold up money for the train station in New York City. Well, how does that work? Congress has the power of the purse. Congress has the authority to determine how much money is going to be spent for what purpose. What is the president's authority to intervene and say, well, I'm going to block that money that Congress has allocated for this purpose because whatever reason, I want to punish a blue state, or I don't like New York City, or I, don't like the governor of this other state, so I think maybe the short answer is I don't think there is authority, because the power of the purse in the Constitution lies with Congress. That's their prerogative, that's their power, that's their authority. But the problem that we have is that we don't have a Congress that is willing to stand up and defend their constitutional authority. Which I don't know. I don't want to get too political here. Probably already have. Probably too late. But I just wonder. Did the framers of the Constitution ever think we'd get to that point? They thought that this separation of powers would be, hey, we're going to check. The legislature's going to check the president. The president's going to check the legislature. The court's going to check them both. The framers ever think that one of the branches would say, oh, never mind. We'll just kind of defer to the president and let the president do what he wants to do with respect to infringing on our authority. I don't think the framers ever envisioned that we would have a branch of government that would be that willing to surrender its powers to another branch. But I think that's part of the reason why we're at today with a lot of these issues.
But do you even have any hope that anything will be any different than anything that you just stated right here? Because, I mean, I'm talking about
Yeah.
if it goes to the Supreme Court, I mean, you know, if they rule,
Well-
why would any ruling be different than what
Yeah.
we watched happen in these last,
Yeah.
you know,
Maybe it
how
goes
many
back to
years?
the question that you raised. I mean, so
Yeah.
Chief Justice Roberts rises to the occasion and says, you know what? The reputation of the Supreme Court, you know, this revered institution is so important that I'm not willing to surrender that to the president. You know, maybe, I mean, if he stands up and defends the authority of the court, its independence, you know, independence of the court. But that's an if. You know, that's a big if, and we'll have to wait and see. I mean, I'm very, you know, I'm not real optimistic, and one of the reasons that I'm not real optimistic is it was the Roberts Court that authorized presidential immunity. It says the president is immune from criminal litigation for any action taken under the president's authority. And so let me give you an example. So he says, basically the Roberts Court says, if the president is acting pursuant to his constitutional authority, whatever he does, however criminal, however horrible it can be, he's immune from prosecution. Point blank, no exception. So one of the authorities, one of the powers that the president has is commander-in-chief, right? And commander-in-chief is control over the military. So guess what? You can blow up boats in the Caribbean that are believed to be, you know, that involve drug trafficking and drug traffickers, and you can invade Venezuela to dispose the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro. You can kill 100 of his security guards in the process. That's a clear violation of international law. No one would dispute that. But there's no legal accountability. You're not going to be prosecuted because you were acting pursuant to the authority under the Constitution, which is commander-in-chief. So as commander-in-chief, you can kill civilians, you can invade countries, you can depose government leaders. There's no the accountability. Basically, the Supreme Court says it's not criminal. You just have to elect him. You got to vote him out of office. But the problem is, you know, what if you're already termed? You're max in terms of your 2 terms in office. So you're not going to get reelected. Well, maybe that is going to impact the next guy that runs for office, you know, in that party or something. But it's not a very satisfying remedy for criminal action if there's no accountability. So then it's like, I thought the rule of law was like no one is above the rule, above the law. Well, apparently that's not quite right. Maybe there's an exception to that rule now in our democracy. There's an exception to that rule.
I think we've got time for 1 or 2 more questions.
Sure.
Last year, in the context of tariffs, the president built up a chart that
Yeah.
had 15, 20 nations on it that were imposing tariffs on us.
Yeah.
And so we were retaliating against them, doing to others as they are doing it
Yeah.
to us, until they stopped doing it to us. And some nations have lowered their tariffs in response to our tariffs on them. And the whole goal is to get tariffs down all around.
Yeah.
But some of these nations are, there's that acronym BRICS,
Yeah,
BRICS
BRICS,
nations,
yeah.
who want to take over, you know, the payment of between nations and stuff. And that's part of Brazil, right? And China and India. And is that part of what the president has in mind, considering that this is like an international threat to the United States?
Yeah, I don't want to suggest that every one of the tariffs that the president has imposed are illegal. Well, they're illegal under this authority. You know, this authority, this statute doesn't provide the legal authority. But maybe the other argument, well, is it appropriate? I mean, is that the proper use of tariffs? So if the use, and it is a proper use of tariffs to address a trade imbalance. So they're imposing 20% tariffs on us, you know, then we can reciprocate.
Without tariffs, and, you know,
Yeah.
but they're trading out with tariffs.
So all I would say there is that that's a proper use We could talk about, yeah, but what about India and what about Brazil? And, you know, because you don't like what they're doing to Bolsonaro. I mean, that's not a proper use, I don't think. And so, but then the question is, yeah, it's a proper use, but you know what? You've got to find the right legal authority for that proper use of tariffs. You know, you can't just use this other statute and just claim, oh, you got to go back to Congress and say, hey, look at this trade imbalance, you know, or yeah, give me 150 days, we'll impose tariffs up to 15% because Congress has authorized that. I can't impose tariffs for 50% indefinitely on every country, you know, I mean, so you've got to do it the right way. It's called the rule of law in our democracy. And if there's a statute that authorizes you to do it that way. If the statute doesn't authorize you to do it, there's a gap, then go back to Congress and say, hey, I need a new statute. Pass a statute, which, by the way, we have a very, you know, Congress that's very compliant to what the president wants done. But this is an easier way. You know, why do it that way? Why should I wait for an investigation? Why should I wait for a determination? Why should I have limits temporally and caps? And I can just do it this other way, and I don't have any of those limitations. There's no cap on the tariffs under IEEPA. There's no time limits on the tariffs under IEEPA. All I have to do is declare this emergency, right? So, anyway, I think Ken's telling me that I'm overstating my welcome.
Unfortunately, we have limits, we gotta be out here by 1 o'clock. Want to thank Jimmy, what a talk, whoa. We've got 3 more days coming up, scheduled with Toy Speaking of what they're still talking about. But Jimmy, thank you very much.
Okay, my pleasure, thanks for inviting me.
Good seeing you.
Enjoyed it.